16 days. I mean, just 16 days. In that incredibly short amount of time, a modern military literally burned through, what was it, 1,800 advanced missile interceptors.
1,300? Yeah, it's a staggering number.
Right. And just to put that in perspective for everyone listening, that is the equivalent of almost 3 full years of global production.
Just completely vaporized.
Vaporized in just over 2 weeks. It's crazy. So I want you to imagine for a second a world where global diplomacy is conducted not in, quiet mahogany paneled back rooms, but out in the open.
Very public.
Right, with public insults, broken treaties, and these high-stakes military gambles all happening basically simultaneously at a single incredibly chaotic summit.
Yeah, which is completely unprecedented.
Totally. Because you usually expect international relations to follow a script, right? Like a very careful choreography of handshakes, calibrated deterrence, measured press releases. But what happens when someone decides to just, I don't know, throw the entire script out the window and the physical military supply chain simply cannot keep up with the rhetoric?
You end up with a fascinating, pretty alarming kind of vertigo, honestly. We are looking at a diplomatic and military landscape that has fundamentally lost its traditional gravity.
Gravity is a good word for it.
Yeah, because the old rules of deterrence relied on predictability, right? But what we are seeing now is the absolute weaponization of unpredictability. And it is stretching both international alliances and military-industrial bases to their absolute breaking points.
Which brings us to today. Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are unpacking a really staggering sequence of events centered around the recent NATO summit in Ankara.
It was a wildly eventful summit, to put it mildly.
To put it mildly, yeah. We are going to examine a situation that is essentially rewriting the rules of global engagement right in front of us. Our mission today is to take a stack of highly complex, incredibly tense geopolitical developments and just, make sense of this turbulence for you.
And to do that, we are pulling from a mix of source materials today that offer very, very different lenses on the exact same crisis.
Yeah, some heavy hitters.
Definitely. First, we have a detailed strategic breakdown from Colonel Douglas McGregor. He's a former U.S. Defense Secretary Advisor, decorated combat veteran, and he offers a highly, highly critical look at Western military strategy.
Right.
And we are pairing his insights with a really comprehensive geopolitical analysis from a recent BBC security brief. That one features direct input from a top NATO military commander, Admiral Van Deer.
Now, before we really get into the weeds here, I do need to set the stage for you listening right now because we have a strict impartiality rule here.
Always.
Always. The sources we are exploring today contain highly polarized viewpoints. We're talking deeply politically charged rhetoric and some very controversial historical takes.
Very controversial.
Right. So our goal with this deep dive is to objectively report and analyze what these sources contain. We are absolutely not endorsing any political side, and we're not taking a stance on the geopolitical conflicts discussed.
We are essentially just your guides.
Exactly. We're here to help you understand the core arguments being made in the material, the underlying logic or maybe lack of logic behind these decisions, and how they mechanically impact the world.
It's all about synthesis and understanding. The landscape is incredibly complex, and navigating it requires us to look at all the pieces on the board, even the ones that maybe make us uncomfortable, without any favoritism or ideological filtering.
Spot on. So here's our roadmap for today. First, we're going to look at the incredibly chaotic diplomacy of the Ankara summit itself and how the traditional diplomatic off-ramp is basically being systematically dismantled.
It's a huge shift.
Huge. Second, we'll examine the kinetic reality of the reignited war with Iran that just developed mid-summit, looking at the limits of what some are calling the Mongolian way of war.
A very intense phrase, yeah.
For sure. Third, we're going to pivot to the changing face of the war in Ukraine, specifically looking at the clash between multi-million-dollar Patriot missiles and mass-produced cheap drone swarms.
The economics of warfare.
Exactly. And finally, we're going to tie all of this back to how these global flashpoints directly threaten the global economy and, by extension, your own wallet by exploring the actual mechanics of the bond market.
It is an immense amount of ground to cover, I know. But the connective tissue between, a diplomatic insult in Ankara, a drone strike in Eastern Europe, and the interest rate on your mortgage is actually surprisingly direct once you start pulling at the threads.
Okay, let's unpack this,
Yeah.
starting with Ankara. Because the sheer unpredictability of the U.S. president at this NATO summit was just the dominant headline.
It completely overshadowed everything else.
Right. I mean, we are talking about a summit that saw a completely unexpected demand by the U.S. to acquire Greenland.
Just out of nowhere.
Out of nowhere. Let's just pause on that. In the 21st century, floating the idea of purchasing a massive autonomous territory that controls crucial Arctic shipping lanes and, immense untapped resources.
And the Danish prime minister's reaction was pretty telling.
Oh, predictably. She bluntly stated that Greenland is not for sale. But the fact that the demand was made in such a public, highly transactional manner, it just sets the tone for literally everything that followed.
Well, what's fascinating here is that transactional mindset. That's the crucial through line.
Yeah.
Because the sources detail the U.S. president publicly savaging Spain over defense spending, and then the reported absolute contempt shown toward him by Italy's prime minister, Giorgia Meloni.
It was essentially a summit defined by public friction.
Yes. And the reason this matters isn't just about diplomatic decorum or being polite. When you shift from private negotiation to public humiliation, you alter the entire psychological framework of how nations interact with each other.
It really feels like a CEO walking into a super delicate board meeting, demanding to buy a rival's parking lot, insulting the board members, and then just handing the company's most sensitive tech to a wildcard contractor.
That is a perfect analogy.
Because right in the middle of alienating all these traditional European allies, there was the highly controversial decision to lift sanctions and provide advanced F-35 fighter jets to Turkey's President Erdogan. So is this just madness? Or is it a hostile takeover of traditional diplomacy?
Well, that's where the underlying strategic logic or, lack thereof comes into play, depending on whose analysis you're following.
Yeah.
McGregor's analysis suggests this is indicative of a broader hegemonic shift. He argues that the U.S. is still trying to operate on a post-Cold War teacher-student dynamic.
Like the U.S. is the teacher grading everyone else.
Exactly. That was a unipolar moment where the U.S. could just dictate terms, demand unilateral concessions, and expect the rest of the world to fall in line. But his point is that era is over.
So they're basically using old tactics in a new world.
Right. By employing this aggressive transactional diplomacy like bribing Turkey with F-35s to pull them away from Russian or Iranian influence, the administration is trying to force a unipolar outcome in a strictly multipolar world.
But let's be real for a second. Does a bribe like that actually secure long-term loyalty? I mean, an F-35 isn't just a plane.
No, it's highly sensitive.
It's basically a flying supercomputer that's deeply integrated into NATO's sensor networks. Handing that over to Erdogan, a leader who the sources describe as innately Machiavellian, seems like a massive gamble.
It is.
You give him the jet, but what actually stops him from pivoting right back to Moscow the moment it serves his domestic interests?
Honestly, nothing stops him. And that is the exact flaw in the transactional logic that McGregor points out.
Just structurally flawed.
Yeah. Transactional diplomacy assumes that a single exchange of goods secures a permanent geopolitical alignment. But historically, that is rarely the case, especially with regional powers who have their own distinct security imperatives.
They're looking out for themselves.
Right. But the larger danger, and this is highlighted in the BBC security brief by former Secretary of State John Kerry, is how this public aggressive posture destroys the mechanics of de-escalation.
And Kerry's perspective is vital here, right? Because he was actually instrumental in negotiating the original 2015 Iran nuclear deal.
He was in the room. He knows the mechanics.
Exactly. And he argues that classical diplomacy is about the painstaking choreography of words. It's about private negotiations.
Yes.
But when the U.S. president gets on a global stage and literally calls Iranian diplomats scum, calling them vicious, violent people, it fundamentally changes the entire dynamic.
Because it destroys what diplomats call the climb-down route.
The climb-down route. Okay, explain that.
Think about the mechanics of a standoff. If you negotiate in private, you give the other side room to make concessions without looking defeated to their own domestic audience.
Saving face.
Exactly. If a leader can say to their people, "We stood our ground, but we made a pragmatic deal," they survive politically.
But if you publicly brand their leadership as scum, you corner them. I mean, they can't make a deal with you without proving your insult right, that they are weak and subservient.
That is exactly the point Kerry is making. You close the diplomatic exit door for them. And crucially, you close it for yourself, too.
Because you painted yourself into a corner.
Right. If you have told your own population that you are dealing with absolute evil, you cannot suddenly turn around and sign a treaty with them. According to Kerry's analysis in the brief, once you destroy the diplomatic path through public humiliation, kinetic military action becomes the only remaining tool in your toolkit.
And man, did we see that tool deployed almost immediately.
Yeah, very quickly.
Right mid-summit, the U.S. president declared that the ceasefire memorandum of understanding, the MOU with Iran, was officially over. And this wasn't just tough talk. It was followed immediately by over 80 military strikes.
A massive escalation.
Massive. Prominently targeting Karg Island.
Now, Karg Island is the center of gravity for the Iranian economy. The BBC brief is very clear on this metric, that single island is the conduit for 90% of Iran's oil exports.
90%?
Yeah. So hitting it isn't just a military maneuver. It is a direct attempt to sever the financial jugular of the state, specifically the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps.
It is an immense structural escalation. And this is really where Colonel McGregor's analysis gets very specific and, frankly, highly controversial.
Yes, this is a very debated point.
He characterizes this renewed war with Iran as a conflict fundamentally driven by Israeli interests and a powerful pro-Israel lobby in the United States. And he describes the ultimate strategic goal here using a very stark historical concept. He calls it the Mongolian way of war.
Which is a chilling historical parallel.
What does that actually mean in a modern context?
Well, the Mongolian way of war refers to a strategy that completely abandons the concept of limited engagement or securing specific geopolitical concessions.
So no targeted strikes or neat little treaties.
Right, none of that. Instead, it is a total scorched earth policy. It's a demand to submit entirely or face complete destruction, leaving only enough of the population alive to pay tribute.
Okay, but let me push back on that framing for a second. If we look at the operational reality on the ground, doesn't the idea of a modern superpower executing a Mongolian scorched earth policy kind of fall apart when you look at their actual tactical execution? I mean, the sources specifically highlight the failed U.S. Special Operations mission in Isfahan.
Yeah, that failure is a crucial data point.
Right. The idea was to insert special ops into Isfahan to secure or remove plutonium. And it seems they were trying to replicate tactics used in places like Venezuela, where local officials could be bribed or coerced to basically look the other way.
A totally different environment.
Exactly. Iran isn't Venezuela. The intelligence was seemingly flawed. The vulnerabilities they thought existed just didn't. And the mission ended in a disaster that had to be covered up with a story about a downed officer.
It really exposes the extreme fragility of special operations in non-permissive, highly fortified environments.
It's not a movie.
No, not at all. As McGregor notes in his analysis, he actually quotes an experienced operator who said, failure is only one RPG away.
Wow, one RPG away.
Yeah, it doesn't matter how advanced your satellite intelligence is or how highly trained your operators are. If a single guard gets lucky with a rocket-propelled grenade and hits a helicopter, the entire million-dollar mission collapses instantly.
Which completely shatters the illusion of these clean, surgical, Hollywood-style strikes. But, the tactical failures are really nothing compared to the logistical nightmare.
The logistics are the real bottleneck.
Right, which brings me back to the stat we opened the show with from the BBC brief. The NATO commander confirmed that in just the first 16 days of this reignited Iran war, the U.S. expended 1,800 PAC-3 Patriot missile interceptors.
The math on that burn rate is just terrifying if you are a military logistician.
I can't even imagine.
1,800 interceptors in 2 weeks. The global maximum production capacity for PAC-3 missiles is roughly 650 per year.
So I have to ask, if the U.S. burned through almost 3 years of its most advanced defensive ammunition in 16 days, doesn't basic math dictate that a total scorched earth Mongolian war is physically impossible to sustain? Are the politicians basically writing massive geopolitical checks that the military supply chain simply cannot cash?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, you are identifying the exact structural vulnerability of modern Western warfare.
The supply chain.
It's what analysts call the supply chain trap. Middle Eastern powers, whether it's Iran or various proxy groups, they are actively observing this mathematical reality.
They see the burn rate too.
Of course they do. They are realizing a profound shift in asymmetric warfare. They do not need to defeat Western militaries outright in a conventional force-on-force battle. They don't need to sink an aircraft carrier.
They just need to wait us out.
They just need to outlast the expensive ammunition.
So they basically just have to keep throwing cheap rocks until we run out of million-dollar bullets.
Yes, exactly. If your defensive shield runs out of ammo in a month, your offensive capability is severely neutralized. because your bases and your assets are now completely exposed. You cannot wage a sustained multi-front war under those logistical conditions.
It's just mathematically impossible.
Right. And this mathematical reality ties directly into another crucial concept McGregor discusses, the nuclear threshold state.
This is a fascinating distinction he makes. He talks about how countries like Turkey and Iran might not actually want to possess a finished active nuclear weapon in their arsenal. Now, why would they avoid crossing that final finish line? That seems counterintuitive.
Because actually possessing a nuclear weapon brings immense, immediate international pressure.
Like sanctions.
Crippling economic sanctions, constant intelligence scrutiny, and potentially preemptive strikes from adversaries. The geopolitical cost of holding the bomb is astronomical. But being a threshold state, well, that is an entirely different strategic posture.
Meaning you have the industrial capacity, you have the enriched uranium and the scientific know-how ready to go, but you just haven't assembled the final components.
Precisely. If you were a threshold state, you can build a functional nuclear weapon in a matter of weeks if you are threatened with ultimate destruction.
It's leverage without the liability.
Exactly. That provides the ultimate deterrence without the daily diplomatic headache of being an active nuclear state.
It's the ultimate insurance policy. If the Mongolian way of war comes for your regime, you flip the switch, you build the bomb.
Right.
And McGregor's argument is that by tearing up the diplomatic MOU, enforcing public humiliation, and threatening these scorched earth campaigns, the U.S. is inadvertently signaling to these nations that they are absolute fools if they don't sprint to become threshold states.
It creates an incredibly volatile dynamic. If a nation's deterrence relies on the immediate threat of a nuclear breakout in response to an attack, the margin for diplomatic error drops to absolute zero.
Zero room for miscalculation.
Any miscalculation could trigger a sprint to a nuclear weapon.
And speaking of the margin for error dropping to zero, let's pivot over to the European theater. Because the exact same supply chain math that is breaking down in the Middle East is fundamentally altering the war in Ukraine right now.
The parallels are striking.
They really are. At the Ankara Summit, a massive announcement was made regarding this. The U.S. is licensing Ukraine to build Patriot missiles domestically.
Now, on the surface, that sounds like a massive victory for Ukrainian defense.
Sure, domestic production. Sounds great.
But we really have to rigorously define what building a Patriot actually means. Because as the BBC brief points out, a Patriot is not just a single piece of hardware. It's an incredibly complex, interconnected battery system.
Right, there's a lot of moving parts.
You have the phased array radar, the engagement control station, the antenna mast group, the launching stations, and then, crucially, the actual interceptor missiles themselves.
And there is a huge mechanical difference between the types of missiles being used. The sources highlight the difference between the PAC-C2 and the PAC-3. Can you break down why Ukraine is so desperate for the PAC-C3 specifically?
It really comes down to the physics of intercepting different threats. The PAC-C2 interceptor is largely designed to take down aircraft and cruise missiles.
Okay.
It works using blast fragmentation, so it gets close to the target and explodes, destroying the enemy aircraft with a cloud of shrapnel.
Makes sense.
But a hypersonic ballistic missile is moving too fast and is way too heavy for blast fragmentation to be reliably effective.
It would just fly right through the shrapnel cloud, basically.
Exactly. So the PAC-C3 was developed. It is what they call a hit-to-kill interceptor. It doesn't rely on proximity explosives. It is designed to physically collide with the incoming ballistic missile at an immense speed, destroying it with sheer kinetic energy.
Literally hitting a bullet with a bullet.
Yes, and doing that requires exponentially more advanced guidance systems, incredible maneuverability, and massive processing power built into the missile itself.
Which is why they are so expensive and time-consuming to build.
Exactly.
And the desperation for this specific PAC-3 technology is grounded in some very dark statistics. The BBC brief highlighted that in July alone, Russia launched 49 ballistic missiles at Ukraine.
49 in 1 month.
Right. And because of the chronic shortage of PAC-3 interceptors, only 4 were intercepted.
4 out of 49. That is a devastatingly low success rate.
It really is.
Meaning the vast majority of those strikes hit their intended targets: infrastructure, military bases, civilian areas.
And the proposed solution, this new licensing deal to build them in Ukraine, faces a brutal reality check from the experts in the BBC brief.
It's not a quick fix.
Not at all. A single Patriot battery costs about $1 billion. Setting up a domestic production line isn't just about handing over some blueprints. You need highly specialized supply chains, clean rooms for sensitive electronics, massive manufacturing facilities.
And
Yeah. The moment ground is broken on that factory, it becomes the #1 priority target for Russian long-range strikes. We are talking years, not months, before a Ukrainian factory could yield a single PAC-3, assuming it even survives being bombed.
which forces NATO to look for immediate, systemic alternatives. They can't wait years. The alliance is making massive new investments to counter the reality of the battlefield right now.
What kind of investments?
Well, the BBC brief notes a $40 billion investment over 5 years, specifically directed at counter-drone technology.
Okay, here's where it gets really interesting. When you look at this conflict, it feels like NATO brought a custom-built $1 million Ferrari to a demolition derby where Russia is driving thousands of $500 junkers.
That's a great image.
The Ferrari is undeniably better, right? Technologically superior in every single way, but it's going to get swarmed, bogged down, and destroyed by sheer volume.
That analogy perfectly captures the tectonic shift in modern military doctrine. For decades, Western militaries operated on philosophy of acquiring exquisite, complex weapons.
Right, the Ferrari.
Highly sophisticated, incredibly expensive platforms produced in relatively small numbers. The assumption was that qualitative superiority would always defeat quantitative mass.
But a $20,000 Shahed drone doesn't care how exquisite your radar is if you don't have a cheap way to shoot it down.
Exactly. The NATO commander featured in the BBC brief, Admiral Van Deer, explicitly outlines this pivot. The new strategy is moving toward deterrence by denial through the mass production of cheap interceptors.
Volume for volume.
Yes. They have to depress the pressure of these low-tech drone swarms by matching volume with volume, because firing a $4 million PAC-3 at a drone made of moped parts is a fast track to bankrupting your own defense department.
So NATO is adapting their intelligence gathering as well, right? The sources mentioned they're acquiring up to 5 MQ-4C Triton maritime drones. Now, these aren't the cheap swarm drones. These run over $200 million each.
Very exquisite.
Yeah. But their value is in something the brief calls pattern-of-life surveillance. How does that fundamentally change the battlefield?
Pattern-of-life surveillance is a huge shift. It's moving from tactical observation to strategic algorithmic analysis. Instead of just looking at a live video feed to see, if an enemy tank is moving right now, these Triton drones stay airborne for massive amounts of time, up to 24 hours at 50,000 feet.
Wow, just hovering and watching.
And they hoover up immense amounts of data over months. They monitor the daily harbor traffic, the shift changes at a military base, the normal electronic emissions of a region.
So they build a baseline of what normal looks like.
Yes. And once machine learning algorithms establish that baseline, they can instantly flag anomalies.
Oh, that's smart.
They don't need to see the missile being loaded. They just need to notice that the supply trucks arrived at the base 3 hours earlier than they have for the last 6 months.
And that triggers the alert.
That anomaly triggers a targeting alert. It is incredibly powerful.
But even with that advanced tech, the BBC analyst points out that you can read NATO's current anxieties straight from their receipts. They're making a very significant shift in their airborne early warning systems. They're moving away from the American aerospace giant Boeing and turning to the Swedish company SAB.
That shift speaks volumes, frankly, about concerns over the U.S. industrial base's ability to deliver on time.
The backlog issue.
Exactly. These airborne early warning planes are essentially flying radar stations that paint the air picture for fighters to identify targets. NATO realizes they can't see enough, they lack sufficient intelligence, and they just cannot afford delays from backlogged American manufacturers.
But according to Colonel McGregor, the true danger isn't just a lack of weapons, it's the escalating strategy and the rhetoric coming from Western leaders.
He is very concerned about the rhetoric.
He issues a very stark warning about the actions of certain European nations and U.S. figures, specifically mentioning Senator Marco Rubio. McGregor asserts that there is a faction actively trying to bait the U.S. into a direct, kinetic war with Russia by supporting and facilitating Ukrainian strikes deep into Russian territory.
Yeah, McGregor uses a very evocative phrase for this. Poking the cobra.
Poking the cobra.
He argues that there is a dangerous complacency in Washington and European capitals, a tendency to basically dismiss Moscow militarily. The logic seems to be, we've provided tanks and Russia didn't start World War III. We provided F-16s, they didn't escalate to nuclear weapons. Therefore, we can provide long-range missiles to strike Moscow, and they still won't do anything.
Like you poke the cobra, it doesn't strike, so you assume it's completely harmless and you poke it harder.
If eventually the Cobra strikes.
Yeah.
And when a nuclear-armed power feels its core existential security is threatened by deep strikes into its homeland, the resulting strike isn't proportional, it's catastrophic.
And McGregor draws a very heavy historical parallel to underscore this risk, looking all the way back to World War II. He claims that Franklin D. Roosevelt and Winston Churchill completely ignored the advice of their military staffs about the looming post-WWII Soviet threat.
That's his reading of it, yes.
He argues they were so singularly focused on the immediate goal of defeating Nazi Germany that they completely overlooked the geopolitical landscape they were creating.
His argument is that by demanding the unconditional surrender and total destruction of Germany, they created a massive power vacuum in Eastern Europe that the Soviets were all too happy to fill, which directly resulted in a 50-year Cold War.
Now, obviously, mainstream historians heavily debate whether FDR or Churchill had any realistic alternatives given the reality of the Soviet Army's position in 1945.
Oh, absolutely. It's fiercely debated.
But whether you agree with his specific historical read or not, McGregor's core conceptual point remains highly relevant. The way a war is fought, and specifically the way it is ended, often directly creates the conditions for the next, potentially more dangerous conflict. Pushing for unconditional victory against a nuclear power might be a strategic fantasy that backfires catastrophically.
And we are already hearing the alarms being sounded by the adversaries. McGregor notes that Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has starkly stated that we were essentially already in World War III.
That's a huge statement.
McGregor's point is that when a diplomat with Lavrov's decades of experience and historical weight uses that specific terminology, you shouldn't dismiss it as mere propaganda or a bluff. You really have to analyze it as a profound warning about how Russia perceives the current escalation ladder.
Especially when you look at how the realities are shifting on the ground for Europe itself. McGregor points out that the era of what he calls the Lilliputian armies of Europe is ending.
The Lilliputian armies.
Right. For decades, these smaller European militaries could afford to underinvest in mass production and manpower because they relied entirely on the immense, unquestioned umbrella of U.S. air power.
But that umbrella is currently being dragged away.
Yep.
As we discussed earlier, U.S. air power and logistical capability are heavily committed and distracted by the Persian Gulf, the reignited war with Iran, and the overarching focus on the Pacific. Europe is suddenly waking up to the fact that they are very exposed and they do not have the domestic industrial capacity to fight a protracted land war on their own.
And you are seeing the political fallout of that sudden exposure right now. There is a palpable shifting sentiment in Eastern Europe. The countries that actually border the conflict, Slovakia, Hungary, Poland, are showing immense fatigue.
The unity that defined the early days of the conflict is completely fracturing under the weight of economic strain and historical realities.
The details regarding Poland in the sources are particularly striking. It mentions President Zelensky returning the White Eagle Award to Poland.
That's a very symbolic gesture.
It is. This highlights how deep historical animosities are resurfacing as the strain of the current war drags on. When the immediate existential threat starts to feel like a grinding war of attrition, old grievances like the complex and tragic history of violence between Ukrainian nationalist factions and Poles during World War II, they just bubble back to the surface.
People lose patience.
Populations become deeply disinterested in losing their own soldiers or bankrupting their economies for a broader war.
It completely shatters the illusion of a monolithic European front. When the immediate security guarantee of the United States is spread thin across multiple global flashpoints, domestic politics, historical grievances, and basic self-preservation start to override alliance solidarity.
Which brings us to the ultimate constraint on all of these geopolitical ambitions, whether in Ankara, Iran, or Ukraine. This is our final segment, and it's perhaps the most important one: the economic domino effect.
The bottom line.
Right. Why should you, the listener, going about your day, care about drone swarms in Eastern Europe or missile strikes on Card Island? Well, because those events are coming straight for the global economy, and they're going to hit your wallet.
The transition from the battlefield to the balance sheet is historically where empires actually fall.
Wow.
You can win every tactical engagement, but military overextension inevitably leads to severe macroeconomic consequences. And the sources we are looking at highlight several flashing red indicators that the financial system is buckling.
Let's start with the most immediate, tangible one: oil. Because the Strait of Hormuz is functionally severely restricted due to the renewed conflict with Iran, Oil is inching toward $80 a barrel.
And while Wall Street might try to artificially suppress the cost of oil by aggressively shorting it in the paper markets or relying on strategic reserves and public statements to manipulate the price, McGregor argues that this is a dangerous, temporary illusion.
Because you cannot short your way out of a physical supply chain crisis.
Exactly.
If the tankers literally cannot sail through the world's most critical energy corridor because they are being targeted by anti-ship missiles, the physical supply of oil drops, the paper market eventually has to reconcile with physical reality.
It's unavoidable. And that fiscal volatility leads to what the sources call the yo-yo effect.
Yo-yo effect.
Yeah, pause this week, war next week, pause the following week. The global financial markets, complex supply chains, and corporate investment models thrive on predictability.
They need stability.
They can price in a disaster, sure, but they simply cannot cope with a chaotic, erratic rhythm of on-again, off-again global conflict. It breaks the modeling.
But the biggest red flag, the absolute siren going off in the background that ties all of this together, is the U.S. 10-year bond yield.
This is the critical metric. This is the math that dictates global power.
Tell me more.
The 10-year Treasury bond yield is the benchmark for global borrowing. It sets the baseline for mortgage rates, corporate debt, and most importantly, the cost for the U.S. government to borrow money. According to the sources, it is inching up past 4.5% and approaching that critical 5% threshold.
I really want to dig into the mechanics of this because it sounds like abstract financial jargon, right? But it's actually the engine of global security. So what does this all mean for you listening right now? Why does a 5% yield on a 10-year bond actually matter? How does that work mechanically?
This raises an important question, and it's easier to grasp than you might think. Think of it this way. The U.S. government operates at a massive deficit. To fund its operations, everything from Medicare to multi-billion-dollar Patriot missile batteries, it has to borrow money by issuing bonds. For years, interest rates were near zero.
Free money, essentially.
The government could borrow trillions of dollars practically for free.
But when inflation hits, central banks have to raise interest rates to cool the economy down.
Right. So now, as old bonds mature, the government has to issue new bonds to pay off the old ones. But instead of paying 1% interest on that debt, they're suddenly having to pay 5% interest.
Oh, wow.
When you are dealing with a national debt of over $34 trillion, a jump to a 5% yield means the fundamental math of the government breaks.
The cost of simply servicing the interest on the debt just skyrockets.
Exactly. The interest payments alone begin to eclipse the entire defense budget. It leads to what financial experts call the destruction of credit.
Destruction of credit.
The government absorbs so much capital from the market just to pay its interest that it crowds out private investment. Mortgages become unaffordable, corporate expansion stops, and the economy stagnates.
Meaning a highly leveraged government can no longer borrow money endlessly to fund both massive domestic obligations like pensions and healthcare and multiple foreign wars simultaneously. You literally run out of credit.
Historically, wars breed inflation. You are pumping massive amounts of money into producing assets, weapons, munitions, drones that are instantly destroyed on the battlefield. They provide no lasting economic return, no infrastructure, no consumer goods. You are injecting cash into the economy while destroying the products of that cash.
More money chasing fewer goods. The classic definition of inflation.
Yes. And when you pair that war-driven inflation with the high interest rates required to combat it, you squeeze the domestic economy completely dry.
And McGregor points out the human cost of this, specifically looking at the decay in Europe. He doesn't just talk about abstract economics. He cites massive physical deindustrialization happening right now in Germany and the UK.
Real factories closing down.
Heavy industries are shutting down because energy costs are too high due to the sanctions and conflicts, and capital is too expensive.
He describes a situation ripe for profound social unrest. He points to a deep fracture in society, fueled by what he terms a parasitic globalist elite that is completely disconnected from the working class.
It's a harsh term, but let's look at the mechanics of what he's arguing. You have parliamentary and financial classes who are insulated from the immediate economic pain of inflation and deindustrialization. But the working class bears the brunt of it.
Always.
They become increasingly dependent on government checks that are losing purchasing power, or they are relying on vulnerable pension funds that the government is essentially borrowing against to fund these overseas ventures.
So if we connect this to the bigger picture, it raises an incredibly important question about the limits of power. If the bond market is the ultimate weapon here, Are we looking at a situation where the global financial system essentially steps in and vetoes a world
Or
war?
vetoes a war.
Not out of a sense of morality or pacifism,
Yeah.
but because we literally mathematically cannot afford the interest payments required to fight it.
It suggests that the true vulnerability of the West isn't a lack of military courage, and it isn't even a lack of advanced technology like the F-35 or the Triton drone. The ultimate vulnerability is a highly leveraged financial system. A system built on the assumption of cheap debt simply cannot sustain prolonged multi-front global conflicts against mass-producing adversaries.
The bond market doesn't care about geopolitical strategy. It doesn't care about democratic ideals or hegemonic dominance.
It just cares about the math.
It cares about mathematics and risk. And the mathematics of a two-front war against adversaries utilizing cheap asymmetrical weapons while simultaneously carrying a historic multi-trillion-dollar debt load at 5% interest, it simply does not work.
It is the ultimate reality check. You can have all the multi-million-dollar Patriot missiles and stealth fighters you want, but if your domestic economy collapses under the weight of the interest payments required to build them, you lose the war without a single enemy soldier ever crossing your border. You just bankrupt yourself into defeat.
And that really is the synthesis of everything we've looked at today across these incredibly diverse sources.
It is. Let's bring this deep dive to a cohesive close and remind ourselves of the through line we've uncovered here, from Ankara to Isfahan to Kyiv to the bond market. We are witnessing a massive real-time transition in how global power operates.
A total paradigm shift.
Right. Unpredictable, transactional diplomacy has shattered the old rules of engagement, closing off the diplomatic off-ramps and forcing adversaries into aggressive corners.
On the battlefield, we are seeing the twilight of the exquisite weapon. Incredibly expensive, highly advanced military tech is being overwhelmed by the sheer, brutal volume of cheap drones and mass-produced munitions.
And ultimately, the deciding factor of these cascading global conflicts won't be a brilliant tactical maneuver by a general on a battlefield. It will be the bond market and global inflation. The era of unquestioned hegemonic power is being challenged not just by rival nations, but by the physical limits of supply chains and the unyielding gravity of basic economics.
Which forces a fundamental reevaluation of what actually constitutes national security in the 21st century.
Exactly. Which leaves us with a final provocative thought for you to mull over as you go about your week. If traditional military superpowers can be bogged down and bled dry by cheap drone swarms, and if their economies are vulnerable to completely unsustainable debt yields, we have to ask ourselves a new question.
What's the new metric for power?
Exactly. Will the next era of global dominance be determined not by who has the most advanced stealth fighter jets or the most complex radar systems, but simply by who has the most resilient, independent domestic supply chains for basic goods, raw materials, and cheap manufacturing?
It is a profound paradigm shift. I mean, if a nation cannot feed its people, power its civilian factories, and mass-produce basic interceptors without relying on an incredibly fragile global supply chain, a chain that is currently under fire in places like the Red Sea and the Strait of Hormuz, then their multi-billion-dollar aircraft carriers become very impressive, very expensive paperweights.
A completely murky diagnostic landscape, just like we talked about at the talk of the show. The traditional diplomatic playbook is burning. The physical military supply chain is overwhelmed by the math of asymmetrical warfare, and the old financial models simply do not apply anymore. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the headlines, keep looking for the underlying math driving these decisions, and we'll catch you on the next one.